So, hello and welcome everybody, and to the TICAD 9 Japan Strategic Vision for Africa in a Changing Global Landscape. Following the TICAD 9 meeting at the end of August this year, we are hosting the first webinar of our Japan program on Japan's role in Africa, to try and foster a dialogue between France and Japan on issues of common interest directly related to our security amid a rising competition on the continent. I will be brief in introducing our two speakers, and they will add something if they want to. But first, we will have Professor Ikegame Mieko. She's now honorary professor at the University of South Africa, but she has held a large number of key positions in the UN system, and the last one was Special Advisor on Africa of UN Secretary General. Then we will have Djenabou Cisse, former research fellow, still associated research fellow at FRS, but now she's a research fellow and advisor at the CAPS at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Both will speak for about 20 minutes, and then it will be followed by a brief Q&A session. The webinar will be only 1 hour. We will finish at 12 sharp. So please do not hesitate to put your questions by pressing through the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of the screen, and do not hesitate to do it very soon. Usually people wait until the end and rush to put too many questions, and we do not have, I will not have time to relay all of them. So without further ado, I will first leave the floor to Professor Ikegame. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. What an honor to have an opportunity to address the people all over the world who is interested in this subject. I have been working for the United Nations for 33 years, and maybe I may look some Asian and in fact Japanese, but my mind is very much of UN and my heart is very much of Africa. So that's what I am. And it is a timely topic that you have chosen, and it is really a pleasure to address this issue. But I have to say, I'm no longer with United Nations, so probably I may say something which is not politically correct, but it is going to be my own view and based on my experience in UN and afterwards with United African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. So let me say, first of all, how did Japan started its strategic process for Africa? There are three things that we should consider. First of all, this TICAD, the Tokyo International Conference for African Development, was born out of the United Nations context. So how did it go? As you remember, United Nations was created right after the World War to combat the or reconstruct the world destruction caused by the war. But as time goes on, the work of the United Nations has shifted to more focused on the developing countries by realizing that world peace, security, and development cannot be achieved without having the rest of the world to be developed and peaceful. And as you remember, that when the United Nations was established, there were only 50 countries. But as it goes in 1970s, particularly, that starting actually in 1950s, that one of the most important effort is to decolonize the world. Therefore, starting Ghana to be independent, one after another, the African country became independent. United Nations plays a big role for the independence of the African countries. Therefore, African countries, United Nations are most respected and important political fora. As the time goes, the second the issue, the reason is that 1992 to 93. Do you remember this was the time of end of the Cold War? And the Cold War has brought the attention of the world to the East European bloc, how to deal with these new countries. And of course, that also added more countries to join the United Nations. And today we have 193 member states. When this Cold War finished, it was a turning point for all of us to look for the new order of the world. And here is Japan emerging from the small country, small economy, 1956, when it joined to the United Nations. The contribution was less than 10%. And Japan was considered as if it is a developing country. However, as time goes on, Japan has a tremendous economic growth and becoming the second largest economy in the world in 1970s. As they grow economically, the international community started to expect Japan's larger role in the international scene. And at the same time, for the developing countries, Japan was considered to be like a model with model which is not West, but non-West background, history and culture, and yet having the economic growth. So from both the, so to say, the donor countries and the developing countries, there was a big expectation that Japan should play a role, bigger role, to the international efforts. How? First, Japan's focus has been always regional development, which means that their focus politically and economically has been always in Asia. And Africa was not too much known to Japan. And particularly during the Cold War, many Japanese companies left Africa and returned back to Japan because of the instability and the security issue in the continent. So Japan has been expected to know more about Africa, and also not only in economic terms, but also play a much bigger role in the world peace and security, as Japan being the only country which experienced atomic bombing. However, Japan didn't know how to do it. The international cooperation, as it stands in our constitution, is supposed to be in the field of United Nations. So they realized 90% of UN work, both in peace and security and development and human rights, 70% are in Africa. So unless Japan came to have more comprehensive understanding of Africa and deep understanding of Africa, Japan's role in the global scene will not be effective. That led to announce that Japan is going to host the Tokyo International Conference for Africa, 1993. By that time, United Nations also has established understanding that the support to Africa has to be comprehensive and also joint effort, not having the interest for donors and interest for Africa and not individual African countries, but it should be consolidated approach to African development. So in 1996, United Nations has a special session of General Assembly devoted for African development. And that led to the adoption of the UN framework for Africa. Now, the second framework we're about to be adopted at the General Assembly in 1992. Japan took the opportunity of adopting this framework. Japan announced that and it will host TICAD for the first time of the International Conference for Africa in Asian region. So this is how Japan has involved in the Africa, and this was a starting point of the strategic vision for Africa. Now it has been more than 30 years since this has started. And let me just quickly say, what are the characteristics of the TICAD, which differs from many other Africa forums? First, the TICAD was considered to be held just one spot event. As they were organizing the TICAD 1, the voices came, and after the TICAD 1 itself, it was African countries themselves requested Japan to have TICAD process on sustainable basis. And Japan honored that request. Why Africa wanted Japan? Because from their point of view, they have been always traditional partners. And having Japan, non-West, to be also another strong partner for Africa will make a competition with other partners so that African countries will have the opportunity to choose which partners they would like to go. That's the first point. The second point is that TICAD has a main principles. One is ownership of Africa and the partnership to respond to the need of Africa. In other words, Japan emphasized Africa to have their own vision, and the development should be owned by themselves, not depending on others, but it should be their own. And international cooperation for Africa should be in response to the need of Africa. And this approach is almost opposite to the colonial approach, as you will realize. The third point is Japan promoted the principle of the South-South cooperation, particularly Asia and Africa cooperation, and then discovered or launched the new approach for the development called triangular cooperation, that the donor country can support South-South cooperation. For instance, the farmer from Vietnam went to Senegal to teach how to farm the land. So Japan paid the expert from Vietnam and sent expert to Senegal. By doing so, $1 worth will be shared by two countries, being the value become double. And this principle was very much appreciated by France. And France and Japan had a South-South cooperation triangular program in late 1990s. So this is the third one. And the fourth one is, as I mentioned, that TICAD is not a bilateral forum. Bilateral means Japan, Africa. No, this is the forum to listen to the voice of Africa for the world to learn the requirement of Africa, not supply-driven, but demand-driven cooperation. So these are the four characteristics. Now, let me touch upon what are the major achievements so far through the TICAD process. First, Africa and Asia cooperation has increased and intensified for the last 3 decades. And the result of that, there are many bilateral platforms between Africa and Asian countries, such as China, Korea, India, Turkey, etc. Second, the participants first TICAD 1 was 1,000 people. Now the last TICAD 9 in Yokohama, there have been 14,000 people. Even the participants of the head of states increased from 6 to 40. Actually, in the last TICAD, there were 33 head of states, but in addition to that, in addition to TICAD, there was Osaka Expo where 8 head of states of Africa attended. So altogether, it became 41. Thirdly, the TICAD is no longer intergovernmental bodies. It is diversified participants, including civil society, research institute, culture, and sports are built in. Fourthly, the main focus now is trade and investment beyond ODA. In fact, there were about 174 194 Japanese companies attended to the TICAD 9, and 324 MOU was concluded, which really shows the interest of the business orientation of TICAD. And the Business Expo itself welcomed 10,000 people, and 200 thematic side events took place. So TICAD has gone beyond intergovernmental bodies, but involving different stakeholders of the society to be interested in Africa. And fifthly, TICAD is now becoming like a blend which is a positive, not war, not poverty, but great potential for growth. TICAD is a brand for Africa to market themselves and give the hope for the global prosperity. It is a place to listen the voice of Africa, not only for Japan, but also the rest of the world. These are, in my view, the major achievements. And of course, today, we are a different global environment. After 30 years, the big development is a wealth of global south and growing power of them. Secondly, unfortunately, recent years, the world started to face many conflicts and instability. But these changes is an opportunity to turn around for the progress. And TICAD is looking at it as a positive environment to bring Africa more effectively to the global peace and development. Now, of course, now China is the largest partner, and many of us are struggling how to cope with this change of the balances, but it should bring the betterment for all of us. Competition is rather distraction. Unity and working together will bring the stronger power, and we need that. Otherwise, we will lose Mother Earth and our humankind history. I have only 2 minutes left. So let me say, let's join the positive dimension and vision of Africa created by Japan. This is not for Japan, but for the global community. We have to look at it. We can't afford anything else. And finally, let me say why Japan continues to have the strategic vision for Africa. There are 6 factors. First, according to United Nations population estimate, when the world population becomes 10 billion people, 4.7 will be African, almost half the population. Year 2050, 1 out of 4 people in the world will be in Africa. Second, there is a dynamic population in the continent. More than 70% of the population is younger than 25 years old. What can you expect more than that? Dynamism and power there, thus potential. The third, continent is very well known for the vast resources, natural resources and mineral, which are very much needed for industrialization and development of our life. Fourth, soon we will face the issue of food supply. More than 60% of non-use arable land is in Africa. They can produce the food to be able to feed all of us. Now, the fifth one is emerging middle class. More than 30% of the population is middle class, and they are increasing. There will be the big change of consumption pattern that will create the big market for the rest of the world. And lastly, IT. The mobile banking is everywhere in Africa. Although the technology was invented by Brazil, it is Kenya which made it marketable. You find the small stand along the street of the road everywhere. People are queuing up with mobile, and you can deposit, but you can receive the fund. We no longer need infrastructure of the banking as such. You will go to the jungle or remote area, you will find a small hut, which is like an internet cafe with solar energy. And young people are queuing to buy only 2-3 minutes to get all the information needed. Africa is no longer isolated. Africa is not controlled by anybody. Information technology will bring the vast opportunity for Africa, and that is taking place now. This is the time to really make an effort to all of us work together to bring win-win situation for Africa and global society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ikegame, for your extremely informed, of course, and the last part particularly focusing on IT, which is something that too often people do forget about the African continent, was extremely interesting. So now I give the floor to Djenabou Cisse for her presentation. Please, Djenabou.
Thank you, Valérie. Thank you, Professor, as well. It's going to be hard for me to follow up, but I will try. So I would like to, just expand a little bit on what has already been said. So I wanted to remind a paradox, actually, which is that Japan has been one of Africa's most constant partners for over 3 decades. Yet one of the least visible actually. We often forget that it's Japan that actually pioneered the African multilateral summits with TICAD, because we always focus on other big summits like FOCAC, for example, by China. But Japan was the first power to actually propose a multilateral summit for Africa. So Japan's engagement with the continent is actually very strategic, but also discrete and long-term. China, the Gulf states, Western powers have been competing for influence, but Japan continues to cultivate ties through a model rooted in partnership, like it was said before, stability and quality rather than strong visibility of volume. TICAD 9 reaffirmed this philosophy, even as the global landscape has shifted dramatically, whether it's Russia's return to Africa or China's economic slowdown, or the slowing, the growing assertiveness of middle powers. Again, it was also said, but Japan has moved from a post-Cold War aid donor, or at least an aid donor posture, to one that positions Africa as part of its strategic horizon, especially in the context of economic security and maritime connectivity. So historically, Japan's Africa policy relied on ODA and capacity building, and it was a model of quality over quantity. But Tokyo's updated development cooperation charter emphasizes a more proactive, strategic use of aid, guided by co-creation with partner countries. Africa is increasingly viewed as a southern anchor of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, IP. So a space connecting East Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the Middle East to secure trade routes, supply chains, and energy access. So in other words, Africa is no longer peripheral. It is part of Japan's broader geopolitical calculus, even though, like my colleague said before, Japan used to have a very regionally focused, a very regionally focus on Asia, actually. So it's interesting to see that Africa has been more and more integrated in this in Japan's broader geopolitical context. Tokyo reaffirmed this approach, actually, but also adapted to African realities, emphasizing inclusivity, infrastructure, resilience, African agencies, like my colleague said. And again, like I said, focusing on coastal and maritime infrastructure, especially along the East African seaboard, with Djibouti hosting Japan's military base, but also all the way to Kenya, Tanzania, and so on. So there's a clear effort to link African connectivity with Indo-Pacific supply chains, particularly around critical minerals and energy security. And going from aid to investment has been the central message of the last TICADs. Japan has confirmed its transition to public-private investment, from ODA to public-private investment partnerships. According to Japan's Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry, this year there were 324 cooperation documents signed at TICAD 9, so which it's more than triple the number from TICAD 8. They had also launched before that the Japan-Africa Co-Creation for Industry initiative in order to promote industrial collaboration, technology transfer, and so on. Following this TICAD, there was a declaration and a commitment to expanding cooperation with startups through the Japan-Africa Co-Creation for Industry and other initiatives, and developing also human resources in the industrial and IT sectors, like my colleague mentioned. So key priority areas have included digital transformation and AI applications, quality infrastructure, resilient supply chains, blue economy and Indian Ocean connectivity, building local capacity, priorities that both align with Africa's growing needs. My colleague mentioned the demographic growth and all the challenges linked to this growth. But these priorities also align with Japan's expertise, because Japan's has been recognized for its technical expertise and for the quality of its infrastructure. So Japan's message to Africa has been increasingly about partnership through autonomy, supporting African countries' ability to diversify their partners without dependency, like my colleague mentioned. And there's been a few initiatives reflecting that also. For example, the Japan-Africa Business Platform for Energy Transition. Also, the support for African debt transparency through multilateral channels. So we can see here the will for Tokyo to promote responsible finance, and as a consequence to distinguish itself from China, as China, on the contrary, has been accused in the recent years of a debt trap, actually, for African countries. There's also the cooperation with the African Development Bank on this instrument called Enhanced Private Sector Assistance. This instrument, so EPSA 5, was ran from 2023 to 2025 with a goal of a $5 billion target, and they actually managed to mobilize 5.6 billion in co-financing, so they actually exceeded the goal. Like I said, or rather, like I suggested, Japan enjoys a relatively positive image on the continent. So the particularity is that Japan's Africa policy remains anchored in values, so democracy, transparency, rule of law, human rights, like Western countries. But contrary to some Western countries, Japan has had a more pragmatic approach. They avoid direct normative confrontation. In their narrative, they tend to focus more on leveraging capacity building and institutional trust. So we have a pragmatic approach with values through practice, rather than values through a very strong normative narrative. So yeah, through values through practice rather than discourse, let's say. And it resonates with many African partners that have grown wary of Western moralism, but also concerned about China's opacity. So Japan can offer a third way, let's say. Talking about China and the China factor, Tokyo's Africa strategy remains anchored in this great power competition with China, even though, putting aside the noble intentions and the efforts and focus on African ownership, we cannot ignore that the great power competition with China has also been a structural element of the strategy in Africa. We can obviously talk about the competing platforms between TICAD and FOCAC, but also Tokyo's emphasis on quality infrastructure as a counter-model to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And even in public discourse, for example, at TICAD 9, Prime Minister stressed transparency, sustainability, human security. So contrasting Japan's model with debt-creating alternatives. There's also Tokyo's support to African diplomatic stronger influence in multilateral arenas for the UN reform and the permanent African seat on the Security Council, which other powers, external powers, also advocate for. And Africa's inclusion in the FOIP strategy is also a way to counterbalance China's influence. And we can see it with the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which was launched with India and also conceived as an explicit alternative to the Belt and Road. So time is running out, but maybe I wanted to say a couple more words also on the quiet security engagement, because also even though Japan's Africa policy has traditionally prioritized economic development and cultural diplomacy, the security dimension has grown markedly since the 2010s. So the shift was initiated especially with the Iraq War and under late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Also the attack in Inamenas in 2013, where Japanese nationals died, also triggered Japan's security engagement in the Sahel. And we have the Japan Self-Defense Forces that expanded maritime exercises with African navies, especially in the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Aden, and obviously the Japan's Djibouti base hosts rotational logistics, humanitarian missions. So it's also a very important strategic asset for Japan. So we African leaders often see Japan as a trustworthy, apolitical partner, but Japan's cautious diplomacy and modest communication mean that its visibility remains low compared to other partners like China or even Turkey and the Gulf. So it was interesting also to note that at TICAD 9, several African leaders called for Japan to show up more, including in direct investment, engaging more with the youth, with creative industries, supporting regional initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area. So looking ahead, there is room for Japan's strategy to grow in Africa. And despite a competitive environment, the US aid cuts, Europe's relative disengagement in areas like the Sahel, many African states despite all of that, many African states want to diversify their partnerships, which could create even more opportunities for Japan to leverage its instrument of influence. So there's, in my view, a huge focus that should be put on concentrating the strategy maybe on select countries and sectors where Japan's comparative advantages align with a partner needs. It's really important to have a strategic approach that can build on partnerships with like-minded actors like France, India, or even Taiwan. And we can building even more Franco-Japanese or Indo-Japanese collaborations. Also focusing on deepening the cultural and human connections to the continent, because even though Japan enjoys this positive image, the human links between Japan and African countries remain very modest compared to other actors. So it will be a very turning point for Japan's strategy. It would give the strategy in another dimension if Japan could actually work even more on this aspect. And I will stop here for the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Djenabou, for this, as always, fascinating presentation and very, insightful from your analysis. So I do not see any question right now. Please, participants, you can put your questions with a Q&A button, and do not hesitate to do it. If not, I will do the question myself, and I will start. A remark on the question first to Professor Ikegame, but Djenabou, you can also answer. We mentioned France, and one objective of that dialogue, TICAD in Japan and the role of Japan on the African continent, as you mentioned very clearly and rightly, Djenabou, is not new at all. Contrary to other actors, like you mentioned China, of course, which is a huge, more than big elephant, trampling in the room. China followed, in a way, Japanese model of building a multilateral forum in order to increase its own interest and its own influence on the African continent, playing on some commonalities in terms of, you mentioned debt trap and so on, focusing a lot on the elite, I think, in Africa. Of course, Africa, a lot of Chinese people are moving to Africa to work, but it's not always with so positive results in terms of perception. But China focuses a lot on elite diplomacy, contrary to what they say, including what some people would mention, corruption and things like that. So, of course, Japan is at the opposite of that. And there is the issue of sharing values, but without being too far away from the realities on the terrain, as you said. And Japan, in a way, succeeded in doing it, but Japan is also a victim of, like former colonial countries, but it's not only, I think, related to being or not a former colonial country. It's related to new norms that has been imposed, and that facing the challenge of countries like China, for instance, it's very difficult to answer. So, Professor Ikegame, how do you see Djenabou mentioned more important cooperation, not important, but more cooperation, for instance, with third countries like France. And how do you see a few fields, because as you know, we are facing also in France huge difficulties in what we do in Africa for many reasons, and including security in the Sahel, and maybe Djenabou can also expand a little bit on that. So how do you see concrete examples that could be acceptable of a better or more cooperation between Europe, of course, but also France in Africa? Professor Ikegame. Hello? Ah. We lost we lost Professor Ikegame. Okay, so maybe
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
yeah, we can now.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Thank you for this very interesting and important question. First of all, the environment today is very different from 30 years ago. In fact, many European countries do not really welcome Japan's advancement in Africa because Japan was becoming too big economy and then dominating the market, both Europe and America. And they thought, well, now Japan is even coming to Africa, which is Europeans or French market. What are they doing here? So there was a lot of resistance at the time. But today it's a different. I think this is due to the fact that China becomes a very strong power to Africa. And in this connection, we must not forget that Chinese relations with Africa goes far in past, particularly during the Cold War. The China was, along with the Soviet Union, to advance the political ideology. And many of the elites, called elites in Africa, was brought to China and Russia and also North Korea. And today, that political interaction is still there because many of them are still alive and some of them are actually leading position in African countries. So China started with a political ground, the cooperation, but after the Cold War, this has stopped for 10 years. During that time, China has taken off economically. So what they needed then is not political, but economical, but they had already political ground to be in order to penetrate into African countries. So we must not forget that there is a big difference between Japan and China in terms of the strategic position and approaches. And secondly, now China is getting in doesn't necessarily mean their penetration is good for African countries, and many leaders realize that. But they can't stop it because it is easy to get in and get the job done. But as my colleague has mentioned, quality is a question mark. So what we can do is Japan and France, and maybe it is true for many European countries, Europe, including France, has a lot of experience and knowledge about Africa. And they have also strong political ties with Africa, and it still remains there. They have a strong connection, network, and penetration power, which Japan doesn't. And Japan's relations with Africa is based on the economic ground and the trust building. And that trust building was somehow questioned by African countries when it comes to Europe. So let's take the strong, the quality of our partners to join them. So the European penetration market, the network, using Japan's trust relationship and technological adaptation and people-centered development, philosophically and in the practical terms for the cooperation, that will bring win-win situation, and that will be good for Africa. And there should be some kind of framework to work together, and there is not such a thing right now. So I think this is one thing we should really focus on the policy level for the, through even the G7. You could come up with a framework to work together, So I would like to place that to start with. And I spoke too much, so I will give the floor to my colleague.
Yes, Djenabou, because it's a follow-on question, so maybe you can jump from that. It's a question from Tom Sullivan, and I just read the question. Could your participants give us a perspective on how the African Union organization participates in TICAD, and should Japan be exploiting this entry point better? So maybe Djenabou, if you can tackle that question. There is another one related to China. You can do that too, maybe. And it's a question about, does a peak China reality opens a wider door for Japan to boost its partnership with China or not, actually? So please, I give the floor to Djenabou. So now we lost we lost Djenabou. Hello, hello.
Allô, oui, désolé. Sorry, I forgot to turn my mic. So yes, regarding the African Union, so they actually have been a co-organizer of TICAD since 2013, I think, alongside the UN, the World Bank. This institutional partnership, it was a turning point because it gave TICAD a more continental framework, and it allowed Japan to its initiatives with the AU's own development priorities in agenda. But in practice, the African Union's participation has remained actually very formal and procedural, rather than very strategic. It's the dialogue is often driven by individual states or by regional economic communities rather than the African Union Commission itself. So that means that Japan's engagement sometimes lack the kind of continental political visibility and continental coordination that other powers like the European Union have developed with the African Union. So I do think that there is room for progress, that Japan could actually use this entry point more strategically. And it doesn't only apply to Japan, actually. I think that the African Union has been kind of slept on by a lot of actors. And especially today, in a time where multilateralism is often put into question and criticized, I think it's even more important for actors to reinforce their cooperation with actors like the AU. So that could mean like maybe more Japan's flagship initiatives that would go through continental programs rather than bilateral through bilateral pipes. Also, like I said, supporting initiatives like the African free trade area. Also, why not a long-term institutional partnership with the AU rather than just, you know, a donor relation. So I think that working with the AU could give Japan a multiplier effect to its strategy on the continent. And regarding China, it is true that China's let's say, China's economic slowdown, and also the more selective nature of its overseas, because China has also been very focused on the Belt and Road initiative and the countries as a result of East Africa and South Africa. So all of that, I think it can create also a window of opportunity for Japan. But we shouldn't think that it's automatic, because one thing that people and even France struggle to understand sometimes is that African countries are not replacing partners by others. of course, putting aside exceptions like the countries of the AES in the Sahel, most African countries on the continent are willing and have been willing for years to diversify their partnerships. So if Japan positions itself as reliable, transparent, innovation-oriented, youth-oriented, one that respects African agency, I think then the whole post-peak China moment can indeed strengthen Japan's relevance. But for that, Japan needs to scale up also its engagement. And it has to find this, this balance between caution and ambition.
Okay, so before I give the floor to Professor Ikegame to tackle, we have 5 more minutes. So I would like just 2 questions. One, a little bit difficult because it's quite new, is many thanks to both speakers, but the question is, I was wondering what changes in Japan's engagement in Africa are to be expected from the new government in Japan. I mean, with a new prime minister, a new government, and I will not have the debate there was around TICAD in Japan, but I'm sure Ikegame-san knows, Sensei knows very well. And the last question, it will be the last question, and you can first answer, and if Djenabou has something to add, is what will be the main challenges for the implementation of the Tomomi Africa program that was adopted at TICAD 9. So first, please, Professor Ikegame, and we have 3-4 more minutes, very short, until 12.
Okay, regarding the new government, I'm really pleased. This is the first time in history we have a lady prime minister. And she is doing extremely well. I must say, all news says she's doing much better than what they imagined. What women can do, which men couldn't. I'm really pleased. This is the time for Japanese men to look at the women differently. The way she demonstrated how to handle Mr. President Trump was amazing. And she is in detail in answering all questions in the parliament and very practical. And that is what the women does, because we are much closer to the reality of the world and reality of life. And I'm sure this kind of attitude is going to be reflected in shaping the new TICAD and the emphasis of Japan regarding the strategic approach to Africa and what the future we could do together positively. Thank you.
So, Djenabou, do you have something to add about Tomomi Africa program? Did you follow the new prime minister in Japan? I'm of course, I'm sure, but do you interpret it and in any way having eventually an influence on different approach or priorities, which is much more important, because the issue for Japan, as you mentioned, is of course a question of priorities, including involving the private sector more, maybe in a more, significant manner. So a few words just to conclude. We cannot hear you.
I keep forgetting. No, maybe just on Tomani, I think it aligned with Japan's will to go from aid dependency to joint value creation. So I think there are really opportunities here surrounding digital transformation, green transition, industrial diversification. For me, again, the challenges will be mainly scale and coordination again, because Japan has been project-based and very careful, and one could say even risk averse but that can limit the impact unless there's stronger alignment with some African frameworks. Also, like I said, Japan has been sometimes described as, and especially Japanese companies, as being risk averse. So without better political risk, and especially political risk guarantees and blended finance, it will be hard to, go through the implementation, I think. And finally, visibility, like I said, visibility and communication. Japan's discretion has been both an asset, but also a factor that can, slower its progress in its strategy. So I think there's also a need to work on the narrative to make it more impactful and visible for African youth, for African entrepreneurs, and maybe again using soft power could be an asset.
Okay, so thank you to both our speakers. I hope our small webinar will have an impact. I see that Ikegame Sensei, one last remark maybe, because we are closing now, but please do if you have a short remark to add. I see the end.
Thank you very much. I wanted to say that Japan sees Africa as an equal partner. We have a lot to learn from Africa. And this is the task of Prime Minister of Japan today, because Japan is the only country where we cannot use different names for the couple. And this has been fought for 40 years, and she's going to do something. And there is one more thing very important she has to also learn from Africa, is look at Rwanda. The percentage of women parliamentarians used to be like a 10% like Japan, but today there are 63% parliamentarians are women. We need a lot to learn from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. So it was fascinating and very interesting, including to me. So we will leave the floor. And as you all know, to the participants, you will be able to watch again or comment est-ce qu'on dit? Put on SNS and, the podcast of that webinar. Thank you very much to both of you and to the participants. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.